The aircraft stood on the runway, engines humming, fully prepared for takeoff. Passengers were steadily finding their seats, some chatting softly, others focused on their phones or adjusting their bags. Among them sat an elderly black man, his fingers tightly gripping his boarding pass, hands trembling, not from fear but from age. He had traveled by air more times than he could count, but something about this flight felt off. Just as he settled in, a flight attendant appeared before him. She had a rigid stance, her lips pressed into a thin line, and her eyes held something unreadable. Was it irritation? Disdain? Whatever it was, it sent an uneasy chill through the cabin. "Sir, you need to leave," she said in a clipped, cold voice. Elijah Carter, a retired history professor, blinked in confusion. He glanced around, scanning the faces of nearby passengers. No one else was being asked to leave. His voice was soft but firm when he spoke. "But why?" The flight attendant crossed her arms, her posture stiffening. "You're making other passengers uncomfortable," she stated flatly. A hush fell over the rows of seats. Conversations faded into silence. The older man felt a sudden tightness in his chest. What was happening? And why? What no one knew was that in just 5 minutes, this same flight attendant would be left utterly humiliated before the entire plane. Stay with this story, it will leave you speechless. And before we continue, let us know in the comments. Where are you watching from today? The journey that was meant to be joyful. Elijah Carter had spent his entire life working hard, teaching young minds about the past so they could shape the future. Now retired, he cherished the rare, meaningful moments spent with his family. This flight wasn't just another trip. It was special. He had purchased a first-class ticket to surprise his granddaughter at her graduation, an event he wouldn't miss for the world. As he walked down the aisle earlier, he had smiled warmly at a young mother soothing her baby and exchanged polite nods with business travelers engrossed in their laptops. He had taken his seat, adjusted his reading glasses, and sighed with contentment. But then, he noticed her. A woman in her mid-50s, well-dressed and perfectly put together, sitting across the aisle. She was whispering something to the flight attendant, her expression tight with displeasure. Their eyes met briefly before the attendant gave a small nod and turned toward him with purpose. "Sir," she said, her voice measured but firm, "I'm going to have to ask you to step off the plane." Elijah frowned, his brow furrowing in disbelief. "Excuse me. I haven't done anything wrong." Her lips pressed into an even thinner line. "There's been a complaint," she said, her words clipped. "A complaint," he repeated, his heartbeat quickening. "About what?" For a moment, she hesitated as if trying to find the right words. And then, she said the one sentence that sent a shiver down his spine. "You don't belong here." A collective murmur spread through the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, others exchanged wide-eyed glances. Elijah's fingers tightened around his boarding pass. His throat felt dry. "Ma'am," he said, keeping his voice steady though his insides churned, "I paid for this seat. Here's my ticket." He held it up for her to see, as if that piece of paper could somehow restore his dignity. Her expression didn't change. "Security will escort you off if you don't comply." Tension crackled in the air. Across the aisle, the woman who had whispered to the attendant sat with her arms crossed, looking completely satisfied. But then, a voice cut through the heavy silence. "This is ridiculous." A young man in a hoodie shot to his feet from a few rows back, his face red with frustration. "He didn't do anything." Another voice followed, this time from an older woman. She shook her head in disgust. "This is shameful." The flight attendant's face darkened. "This is none of your concern," she snapped. Elijah exhaled slowly, forcing himself to stay calm, but inside, something in him twisted. This wasn't just about a seat. It wasn't even about a flight. This was about something much deeper, about dignity. About history repeating itself in the most painful of ways. Then, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the aisle. A strong, commanding voice broke through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" The captain had arrived. The moment everything changed. The flight attendant straightened her posture immediately, as if she had been caught off guard. "Yes, Captain," she said briskly. "This passenger is refusing to leave after a complaint." The captain's sharp eyes flickered between her and Elijah. "What kind of complaint?" The flight attendant hesitated, her confidence faltering. "Passengers felt uncomfortable," she muttered. The captain's brow furrowed. "Uncomfortable. Is there a safety issue?" She swallowed hard. "No, but..." "Is he being disruptive?" Her face paled. "No, but..." The captain's expression darkened. "Then why are you asking him to leave?" The air in the cabin became unbearably thick with silence. All eyes were locked on the confrontation playing out before them. "Sir," the captain turned to Elijah with an air of professionalism. "May I see your ticket?" With slightly shaking hands, Elijah handed it over. The captain glanced at it, then looked back at the flight attendant. His voice was cold, unyielding. "He has a first-class ticket. He is exactly where he belongs." A hush fell over the plane. The flight attendant's mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. "But you," she stammered. The captain cut her off. "You," he said icily, "are out of line." Then, to everyone's shock, he reached for the intercom. "To all passengers," his voice rang out, calm but authoritative, "I sincerely apologize for this unacceptable behavior from a member of our crew. It does not reflect our values, and I assure you this situation will be addressed immediately." The response was instant. Passengers erupted into hushed whispers. Some gasped. Others murmured in agreement. Minutes later, a supervisor boarded the plane. A brief but hushed conversation took place. And then, with her face drained of color, the flight attendant was asked to step off the aircraft. I was just following procedure," she stammered. The captain didn't blink. "No," he said, his voice steely. "You were following prejudice." The moment she stepped off the plane, a ripple of applause swept through the cabin. Some passengers even stood. Elijah let out a slow breath, the tension finally easing from his shoulders. But deep down he knew. This moment wasn't just about him. As the plane finally lifted into the sky, the young woman beside him leaned in and whispered, "I'm so sorry this happened to you." Elijah gave a small, knowing smile. "It's happened before," he admitted softly. "But this time people spoke up." He paused, exhaling. "And that was the difference. Because prejudice thrives in silence. And today, silence lost.